Nothing contained in this recording is intended to encourage the use of illegal substances. This recording represents only the opinions of the hosts and their guests and should not be taken as medical or legal advice. In no way does listening, reading, corresponding, or interacting on social media with our content establish a doctor-patient or legal relationship. The content here is intended to share thoughts and opinions to foster constructive discussion. Please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions concerning psychedelics. The views expressed by hosts and guests on this recording are not necessarily the views of Psychedelia or any other company with which the hosts and guests are associated.
Hello, fellow traveler. Welcome to Psychedelia, brought to you by psychedelia.live. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jeff Zuber. I am a founder of the law firm Zuber Lawler LLP. Our firm is on the cutting edge of new frontiers, including crypto and esports, cannabis, and of course, psychedelics. We handle all aspects of business, including transactional litigation, and our attorney roster is tops in the industry. We're also founders of the pioneering industry magazine Psychedelia, for which this podcast is produced. I'm here with my trusted companion, Radhi Shah. Los Arias could not make it.
Hello there. This is your co-host, Radhi Shah. I'm a foreign attorney at Zuber Lawler, specializing in technology law and protecting IP rights. My work entails working closely with plant medicine and biomolecular technology. Travelers, the world of psychedelics has seen a major pushback against a new proposed rule change from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, that would see 5 more psychedelic drugs placed in Schedule I under Controlled Substance Act. On January 14th, the DEA published a notice of proposed rulemaking announcing its intention to name 5 more tryptamine drugs as Schedule I substances, like 4-OH-DIPT, 5-MeO-AMT, 5-MeO-MIPT, 5-MeO-DET, and DIPT. These are 5 drugs that are tryptamine hallucinogens. They share structural and pharmacological similarities with several Schedule I tryptamine hallucinogens, such as alpha-methyltryptamine, AMT, N,N-dimethyltryptamine, DMT, 5-methoxy, N,N-diisopropyltryptamine, 5-MeO-DIPT, and psilocybin. Till date, they have no approved medicinal use in the United States. In the initial rulemaking, filing for 5 tryptamines, the DEA said that it took into account research and recommendations from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which found that these substances are being abused for hallucinogenic properties, as well as its own 8-factor analysis before it made the scheduling proposal. Comments on the proposed rule via the Federal Register closed on February 14th, and majority of submitted responses appeared to criticize the DEA's judgment in this case.
Well, it's no shock there. It is disappointing that the proposed classifications on Schedule I seem to, again, ignore the most relevant studies and the potential medical benefits of psychedelics, as well as the potential for abuse. I think they're erring on the side of caution, as is often the case. On February 16th, an administrative law judge issued an order that sets those hearings into motion. The DEA and relevant researchers, advocates, and other stakeholders contesting the rule submitted arguments. And the pre-hearing conference will be held virtually on May 4th of this year. The function of the Office of Administrative Law Judges is specifically to adjudicate in cases related to DEA enforcement and regulations. In this particular case, the opponents of the agency's proposed ban are hoping the judge will ultimately recommend either a lower schedule or no schedule at all for these 5 compounds.
Though that said, the head of DEA isn't bound by the judge's recommendation, and past administrators have ignored them in similar cases. Not everyone who takes issues with a DEA regulation is entitled to this type of administrative hearing. Each person or entity that makes a request for a hearing must demonstrate that they would be uniquely impacted by policy change, adding to significance of the fact that the judge granted 5 requests for this one proposal. Say, Jeff, when we talk about these different schedules, what do they mean and how are the drugs distinguished between them?
Well, Schedule I drugs have no medical value and a high potential for abuse. At least that is the stated criteria for that classification. While Schedule II through Schedule V substances all have some medical value, but differ in ranking depending on their potential for abuse from high to low. The lower the number, the higher the potential for abuse. The medical use versus no current medical use dichotomy is critical. And the lower the number on the schedule, the more scrutiny a substance receives. Some examples of drugs that are on each schedule, and when you hear them, you can decide for yourself whether or not you think that it fits either one or both of those criteria. But obviously, there is a lot of controversy with regard to what is scheduled where. But some examples of Schedule 1 are cannabis, heroin, LSD, ecstasy, and magic mushrooms, for which the active ingredient is psilocybin. Schedule 2, cocaine, methamphetamines, oxycodone, Adderall, Ritalin, and Vicodin. And you'll start to see some name brand items as we go further, things that have been approved for some medical uses. Schedule 3, Tylenol with codeine, ketamine, which is a big subject with regard to the psychedelics community today, anabolic steroids and testosterone. Schedule 4, things like Xanax, Soma, Darvocet, Valium, and Ambien. And Schedule 5, Robitussin AC, Lomedil, Modafinil, Lyrica, and Parapectolin. Now, in general, Schedule 1 and 2 drugs have the most regulatory restrictions on research, supply, and access, and Schedule 5 drugs have the least.
That is very informative. Thank you, Jeff. And I'm sure our guest for the day would have many insights to share on this topic and her journey as well. I would like to introduce Melissa Lavasani. Melissa is the founder and executive director of Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, the first member association focusing on advocating for psychedelics at the federal, state, and local levels of the government. Prior to founding PMC, Melissa was the proposer of Washington, D.C.'s successful 2020 ballot measure, Initiative 81, the Entheogenic Plant and Fungus Policy Act. Inspired by her own experience of using plant medicine to heal her severe postpartum depression, Melissa led the Decriminalize Nature DC campaign to the largest ballot initiative victory in the history of our nation's capital.
Hello, Melissa. Thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to get someone with boots on the ground that is actually trying to make some progress on these issues and talk to our government for all of our benefits. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Jeff and Radhi.
And let's dive right into it. We have some questions for you. First, what is the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition and what are the goals of the organization?
So yeah, you can think of us as just a typical trade association with a bit of a different twist on it. I think that, there are many facets to psychedelic medicine and business is just one part of it. So every industry has an association that represents their wants and needs in Washington, D.C. And while I was in the midst of the campaign, I realized we were uniquely positioned here in the nation's capital to create an organization like this. And there was a real need for a group or an organization to be educating our lawmakers and government officials on this subject matter. I think that the concept of psychedelics has been really politicized through the U.S.'s history. And it's really important that we destigmatize psychedelic medicine and we reframe the argument in a way that lawmakers can understand.
It sounds like that could be a very frustrating proposition.
It's challenging.
Yeah. How's your journey establishing the organization been so far?
It's been a bit of a whirlwind. So we started at the beginning of 2021. The Decriminalize Nature DC campaign ended in November 2020, and I knew there was an immediate need for this. So I began planning for PMC start and kind of towards the end of the campaign. And then in January 2021, we kicked it off. And I think that our goals were really ambitious last year. And it was a bit of a learning lesson for us as we started to have meetings with congressional offices. We had assumed that members in their offices were much more educated on what was happening in the psychedelic world and the history of psychedelics in U.S. history. But we were really starting at ground zero with them. So our goal from here on out moving forward is, always be requesting research funding. I think that research opens up a lot of doors for any kind of medicine that we're, looking to explore, but especially psychedelic medicine. So we were advocating for $100 million in appropriation funding for research funds to come out of NIH. But what we found was it was really hard for us to make this argument while the members didn't have the education that they needed to defend this. So we spent a lot of 2021 purely educating staff and the members about the long history of psychedelics, how there was a really robust research community surrounding this in the 50s and 60s. And as soon as the war on drugs started, that all came to a screeching halt. A lot of them weren't really aware. Everyone was aware of the war on drugs, obviously, and how it started, but they didn't really realize that there was research that was occurring at that time. So, and now they weren't aware that for at least 10 years now, there's been psychedelic research that's just been popping up all over the country in various institutions. So we started from ground zero and spent a lot of time just in conversation and just trying to just flood them with as much information as possible about psychedelic research so that we can build up to this year's appropriation request of $100 million for research funding through NIH. And even still, members get new staff all the time. We have to always be focusing on, expanding their knowledge of this world and making sure they're making informed decisions about this.
Do you feel like, at least so far, that they've been receptive to this education? Do you think that they in turn want to help educate their constituents to make sure that everyone is on the same page? Or do you feel like the discussions you're having with them are in some cases hitting a wall because there's a cultural resistance within politics to opening yourself up to these new things?
It's really interesting. I think there's more curiosity than anything else. Psychedelics have been really politicized. However, we've come to a time now, especially in this kind of quasi-post-pandemic world that we're living in, where mental health issues are front and center. I think almost everybody has dealt with a mental health issue or a pressure at some point in the last 3 years that we've been dealing with this. And, I think that psychedelics really provide a unique opportunity to solve some of our biggest problems that we're having in this country. Depression, suicide, and addiction. I think almost every member on the Hill has a constituency that is really struggling with opioid addictions. This is a very big problem that's affecting all people from all socioeconomic status across this country that we haven't really been presented with the solution for yet. And psychedelics can provide some relief from this and, can really provide an opportunity for these lawmakers to provide a solution for them. So I think that there's curiosity about this, and we're battling other issues here. It's not so much the politicization of this. I think there's support, bipartisan support on both sides of the aisle for psychedelic research. I think where we get into sticky subject areas is decriminalization and descheduling. That is a topic that I have yet to broach with our lawmakers. And I quite frankly don't think they are ready yet. I think that when we're keeping focus on psychedelic research, they're really receptive to it and they're really open to it. It's just a matter of making sure it is one of their top priorities for funding. But when you're talking about descheduling a medicine and decriminalizing a medicine, we've kind of seen the struggle that cannabis is going through right now, where there's been so much progress that's been made on the state side, but on a federal level, we're really hitting a brick wall with cannabis decriminalization, and I think that's when the politics enters. So, I think when we get there with psychedelics, we'll see what kind of resistance we head up against. I think it's going to be a little different than cannabis, in that there aren't a lot of people in jail for minor cannabis offenses or minor psychedelic offenses, and there is an issue with that in cannabis. But I think that once cannabis does break through, and it will eventually, that will really open the door for psychedelics to make it through hopefully easier.
Yeah, it's interesting. You brought up the addiction. One of the studies, we actually discussed it on our previous podcast, the efficacy of some of these. And again, this was just one study, but it was a well-respected study. And I believe the number was as high as 80% remission for nicotine addiction. And even months after the study, I think as much as 60%. Had still been off and abstinent of the substance. And then when you look at the highest efficacy of the products currently to treat the same addiction, I think it was 35%. So you're getting numbers at least twice as high. It's very encouraging. And so I think it sounds great that they're open to research. And I believe that is the logical first step. But the cynicism with politics, and people not wanting to go in the right direction, and difference for politicians when to lead and when to just follow your constituency. And hopefully the studies and the research continuing to come out in this direction will open those things up and give them the tools that they need to talk to their constituency and say, look, there's some real value here, and move in that direction. I tend to be cynical, but hopefully I'm wrong.
Yeah. And that was the thinking behind starting with just keeping the focus on psychedelic research is let's get some federal funding through the door. Let's put that in the hands of the institutions that are doing this work. Let's allow these institutions to build that body of data. Any data that's federally funded is deemed as more reliable than other research. The whole point is to create an argument around this that's so bulletproof that they can't say no to descheduling. I'm confident that the data that will come out from psychedelic research, if it's anything like what currently exists, this is going to be profound. This is going to be life altering. This is going to be country altering. Really, this is society altering. So we're just trying to make the argument so bulletproof that there's no political reason to say no to this.
Good luck.
Thanks.
What are some of the political issues that you faced while your members have been advocating for the PMC?
I mean, really, it's just been a difficult environment to operate in. There's been so much going on here domestically and now so much going on internationally with the world that, for something to get funded, it needs to be in like one of the top 3 priorities of the members' kind of like wish list of things to fund. And last year, obviously, we were educating, but we were still advocating for that research funding. There was so much going on with the infrastructure bill and COVID relief that it was very hard for us to kind of wedge ourselves in a top priority of any members' offices. I think now that we're transitioning to this new world, I think that there is opportunity to get in on some of these offices' top priorities. I think it's just being persistent enough and making that argument over and over that this needs to happen and this is going to solve so many problems. And if it's not this year that we get this funding, I'm really hopeful that next year we can get some research funding and then get the ball moving. But I think at this point, there's enough members to, really build some traction on research funding. And if it doesn't come through an appropriations request specifically in the budget, then I think there's really good opportunity for a standalone bill that looks at psychedelic research funding that we can get through later this year, at least get introduced. And, in that is another touch point to educate different offices, because with appropriations, you have to work strategically through the right committees. So you have to really target who you're talking to and be pretty smart about it. But, when you have a standalone bill, you want to reach as many offices as you can to get as much support as you can. So I think that there's a lot of really good opportunity here.
Thank you. What are your views on some the current federal regulations pertaining to psychedelics? How much sense does it make? How did we get there? I'll give you, for example, ketamine is obviously on Schedule 3. There are ketamine clinics all over the country. Yet you have things like psilocybin, MDMA that show similar efficacy on different ailments, and also perhaps slightly less potential for abuse than some of the other more addictive substances and recreational drugs out there. How did we get to the current system, and what would be right now, based on the current studies that we have, where do you think would be the place to draw the line if you were Queen Melissa and could just dictate where it should be?
I mean, if I could dictate, I would educate the public as much as possible and let, deschedule all of these medicines, because I think, there's a lot of value here. But I think that ketamine's obviously, the front runner in the psychedelic world. I think the government likes substances that can be manufactured because then you can control them much more. So MDMA is following the path, and that'll be the next drug that will come to market and be available for use in a medical setting. That's also can be manufactured. It's easy to control and test. Psilocybin, there's synthetic psilocybin in FDA clinical trial right now. I'm confident that'll get through pretty easily through clinical trial. I think that there's some really positive research coming out of that and potential there. It'll be tricky to get the natural substances to be really palpable for our federal officials. I think that's where you kind of walk into shaky ground, and our government loves to control things. So anything that's out of their control, they're uneasy about. But, there's so many traditional practices with the natural medicines that I think all we need to do is just connect the dots for them and, educate them about the long history of psychedelics in a traditional setting. And that'll come with time, but, ketamine really laying the way for us. And what's coming out of MDMA clinical trials is really positive. There are some other regulations that provide access to legal psychedelics. The Religious Freedom and Restoration Act was passed in the mid-90s, and that was because the Native American Church practices with peyote. And this is a tradition that they've had for thousands of years. And, that act was passed, and there's a current effort right now to reform the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act because it hasn't been touched since the mid-90s. And there are issues with peyote conservation that really need to be addressed. So I'm hopeful that will happen here on the horizon. And most recently, though, there was the Right to Try Act that was passed during the Trump administration, where the federal government passed this law that basically said if you are terminally ill, you can try any medicine that has gone through phase 1 clinical trial. There are some issues with right to try. It's passed federally, and it's passed, I believe, in 48 states, but a majority of the states have passed it as well. But it is a pretty new law, and there is issues with the DEA upholding that law. So right now, they haven't granted any permissions for any terminally ill patient to try psilocybin, which has gone through the appropriate avenues to be available under right to try. That's where we're seeing a little bit of that, the politicalness of.
That's where you're seeing the politics, I would say, become a little bit more flexible when you're talking about issue of religious rights and patients' rights versus just looking at the other two things we're talking about, the schedule in terms of potential for abuse and medical use. I mean, they overlap, but you're focusing on particular groups that should have access versus the general public.
Yeah. And, this is a subject that I think that a lot of people can really sympathize with. Somebody is dying or has terminal cancer, and they're very limited on time. And, that brings up a lot, that brings compassion to the issue and brings a lot of storytelling, which I found is really powerful in this space. However, the DEA is an enforcement agency. However, it is a regulatory agency as well. And they lean more on the side of the enforcement. And, it's really like going up against a very high brick wall. So getting them to kind of adopt right to try as a valid way for access has been difficult. And, there is a big effort right now to push the DEA to just uphold the law and allow some of these patients to access psilocybin therapy, because everyone should die with dignity and, not die depressed and anxious and worried for their family and who they leave behind. we should allow people to die with peace of mind that everything is going to be okay. So it's a tough subject matter.
Yeah, well, that human element is very important. But also, if you just look at it logically, the second factor in terms of likelihood of abuse, but end-of-life care becomes a lot less relevant in terms of the addictive quality of it. Even opioids, which were overprescribed, and I think everyone's in agreement on that, and the horror that it caused. I still think opioids for end-of-life care can be a miracle drug and the right tool for the job, because addiction is not so much of a problem at that point. So let these people have this relief.
Yes.
But it makes a lot of sense. I still think that, and it's hopeful. I mean, more people having access to it, I think, would be a great thing. As you started with, do these studies to show, and certainly I do think that as we do more studies, we are going to become more cognizant of risks as well, and we may have to adjust what we think they are. It's just, it seems like out of an abundance of caution, there's a lot of mislabeling of what these substances are and the qualities of them. I don't want to demonize anyone. I think that a lot of people are doing these things for the right reasons. But then again, people who could benefit a great deal from these substances don't have nearly the access they should because of these misclassifications.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You hit the nail on the head. It's a fine balance between touting the benefits of psychedelics and also, cautiously moving forward with this and making sure that we're creating a system that puts the safety of Americans first. And that's not an easy task. There's so many individuals in this country in different scenarios and upbringings that people have that go into an experience of psychedelics that it has potential to kind of fall off the rails. So that's why I think on a federal level and really on a state level, we are moving at a snail's pace and being really thoughtful and cautious about what we're promoting.
Why do you think it's taking so long to decriminalize psychedelics at the federal level? And who, if you can identify someone, who are the primary stakeholders pushing in the other direction against legalization, besides just general politics and cultural issues? For instance, where does the pharmaceutical industry stand on this? Things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the pharmaceutical industry, I think, is sitting back and letting us figure things out first. I think that they're absolutely watching us. I believe they have the most lobbyists out of any industry that exists, but they are very aware of what's happening. This has potential to upend their business model of keeping people on medication and having that constant stream of revenue, because like that smoking cessation study you referenced earlier, that was based off of one dose of psilocybin. That doesn't even compare to wearing a patch every day or chewing gum all day long. That is,
it works too well.
It works right. It works a little too well. So I think they're letting us kind of do the dirty work and have the psychedelic movement itself breaking down the barriers. And there will absolutely be a grab of companies that get bought up by the pharmaceutical industry. And it's kind of on us to make sure that that is done with integrity and, making sure that as companies get bought up by big pharma, that, we are ensuring that access will remain the same. And this is not, purely profit driven. After all, this is all about helping people with their most pressing problems. So that's definitely happening, but like much further down the road. The decriminalization discussion, that brings in a lot of the political baggage that the war on drugs is really ingrained in our brains. Even before I started on my own journey with psychedelic advocacy, I had it in my mind that people who use psychedelics on a regular basis were burnouts, didn't have their life together, were escaping their reality. I had my ideas in my head, and I realized that when I experimented on my own, it's like I saw the truth, and I discovered that, it wasn't this stigmatized concept that I thought it was. And I think that the barrier to decriminalization, it's just really like very political. The US federal government being very slow to change and very risk averse. I think that with cannabis decriminalization taking as long as it has, it's this big monster to them. And I think that once cannabis gets decriminalized at a federal level and our society doesn't fall apart, they claim it will, I think that will change a lot of things for decriminalization after that. But until cannabis gets decriminalized, psychedelics will not be decriminalized. There's no way that our lawmakers will be jumping over cannabis to fast track psychedelics because it shows more medical value. It's just cannabis advocates have been doing this for so long that I think that the lawmakers that are in support of decriminalization, just in general, will want to take care of cannabis first and then move on to psychedelics. So for opposition, I mean, obviously there's on the right and the left side, there is real barriers to even having a decriminalization discussion. Like I said, we're not having these discussions at all at the federal level. I've had offices explicitly tell me that they will not have a discussion about psychedelic decriminalization. But again, that's why the research can be really powerful and can prove that if we decriminalize, like what kind of behaviors come out of psychedelic use, and we can have data on that would support that.
Do you think the potential concern about floodgates of what cannabis would lead to is also leading to more of pushback on legalizing cannabis for what's going to happen next? The latest polls I've seen, Melissa, are like over 70% approval rating on legalizing cannabis or decriminalizing, but some form of providing more access. Those numbers are way up from just a decade ago. And when you see numbers like that, you're wondering, well, now what's taking so long? With politicians that are armed with over 70% poll numbers recently and consistently.
Yeah, it's fear. No one has stuck their neck out there for this yet. And it's fear of literally not getting reelected and losing their job, and fear from, their big major political donors. It's really fear driven, and it's not based in data. And that's where I think the real problem with cannabis is that it came hard and fast, and there was medical claims that were being made about cannabis that were not proven by data. And I'm not even just talking about like cannabis THC, like even hemp or even CBD. And, there were claims that were made. And this is like the biggest feedback and really a learning lesson for me in the discussions that I've had with Congress is that they wanted to see research on cannabis, and that's not what anyone was asking for. They jumped straight to decriminalization. So it's really like not knowing what you don't know and not being able to, put your neck out there for an issue that you really care about because you think it might be okay, but you aren't quite sure what the result will be. So it's a lot of what doesn't happen is based on what they're afraid could happen if they do it. So it's really a shame because the recent poll numbers are really astounding for Americans' perspectives on cannabis. And it's just so fascinating to me because like my 94-year-old immigrant grandmother takes cannabis every day for, her aches and pains. And it's helped her so tremendously in a way that pharmaceuticals couldn't help her. And it's a shame that we're kind of stuck in this place now where we have to move forward so that, what's happening in our federal government and the laws are getting passed in line with what society believes. And we're just stuck, but it's going to reach an inflection point and it's going to change soon. We can't keep having this argument over and over. I think that now that it has become more acceptable, there's going to be increasingly more political pressure on them to do this, and it's going to start costing them votes. So it'll change soon.
I would like to share your optimism, and I do think it will change. But sometimes it just surprises me how slowly things move. And I just think about these congressmen and women, in their back rooms doing all of these substances while they advocate against it, understanding the nature of them on both of the levels of potential for abuse and medical use. And just not showing the leadership. And I believe when you see numbers that are as high as 70% for the general public approving it, that there are just too many politicians that are concerned that one issue voters are going to be against it more so than the people who approve it will actually vote on the issue. So that they're probably, in terms of self-preservation, are making very intelligent decisions, even though if you just look at the general number, it may not make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, Biden's approval ratings are really low right now, and he could, with a swipe of a pen, make this massive change for the country, but he still won't do it based on, how increasingly politicized everything has gotten in this country.
Yeah.
Any word that you say, look at Obama. He wore the tan suit, and that became like such a news story on Fox News that was against him. And it's just a tan suit.
Yep. Well, it is frustrating to see. Again, I don't like to demonize, and I do believe that they do have a responsibility to do what their constituents want. And so hopefully the invitation to engage them with regard to the research is going to be relevant to the future decision making, that they are going to take into account this research, because it seems to be moving overwhelmingly in that direction in terms of the potential. Again, I don't like to use the word miracle for anything like this, but the numbers and the efficacy, it's just outrageous. I wanted to just step back a little bit. And in terms of your own personal experience, was there anything that pushed you into this advocacy? Anything that from your own growing up and that led you to take this on?
It wasn't until I had my own experience with my mental health that I felt like advocating for anything, really. I've always voted, but the sticking your neck out there and being a public person was never my thing. I was very happy with being behind the scenes on anything. My husband works in the local political world here, and I always assumed that he would be the one that was working in politics. But, when I had my second child, I was dealt with a pretty severe case of postpartum depression. I had anxiety. I was having suicidal ideations. I had delusions. I was hearing voices. It got to a really bad point in my life, probably the worst time in my life ever. And, I couldn't quite understand why I had achieved a lot of my life goals. I had this amazing husband. I had a beautiful family with 2 healthy children, live in the middle of DC, had a really good, stable job. And yet I was so miserable. And I discovered that psilocybin mushrooms had an amazing healing potential. And my husband had, in his younger years, had recreationally used psilocybin mushrooms. That was just what him and his friends did where he grew up. They would eat mushrooms, they would go see music, they would hang out. And, he didn't really realize when he was doing it. But, when we learned from this podcast that there's actually research that's backing this, we were desperate for a solution for my depression. This was impacting my parenting skills. I really wasn't even being a parent at the time. I wasn't engaged at all with my children. It was impacting our marriage. We were in and out of couples counseling because that was his way of getting me into therapy. Because, I was not engaged with therapy myself. I tried many times to get into a practice of therapy, and it was just, I was too depressed to really engage in it. I didn't want to take antidepressants. I had a friend who took his life on antidepressants. So I always questioned their efficacy. I had friends that would be on antidepressants for like 10 years and still be battling depression. So this is all very jarring for my life. So when I discovered psilocybin mushrooms, we didn't talk to anybody. I didn't ask anybody if they had access to them. It was a very frightening time because I was really curious about this, but I didn't want to out myself. I'm a DC government employee. Like, obviously that would not fly well with my employer. We started to grow psilocybin mushrooms in the closet of our bedroom. And after we had our first batch come in, I started microdosing, and it was a matter of 3 days of microdosing where I started to have some relief from my symptoms. I was walking straighter. I was speaking differently. I started performing at work. Things started to slowly transform in my life. And it was kind of shocking because, at that time I was desperate to try anything, even something that was a Schedule I drug and illegal to do. But I also knew that I wanted to stick around for my family. And if I continued without treating my depression for very much longer, I wasn't going to be around. So I took a risk and, I tried this method and it was really positive and it works. But, I didn't have a support system. There wasn't like a community that I could go to of, moms in similar positions that were trying to microdose. I mean, it's a completely different world now where we have Instagram accounts and community meetups where, people are openly talking about this at that time. And it wasn't that long ago, 2017, 2018, 2019. There was really no resources other than like Reddit and YouTube. So it was a risk that I took. We tried growing more mushrooms to continue my microdosing, but they're very difficult to grow. We had a batch get contaminated, and that meant like months of work that just like went away instantly. I got introduced to ayahuasca through a friend of mine, and I participated in a few ceremonies, and that completely transformed my life. And at the same time that I was participating in ayahuasca ceremonies, I was watching the Decriminalize Denver campaign happening. So I had reached out to the leaders of that campaign and just kind of probed them on what kind of barriers they were facing and how that campaign was going. And that really inspired me to, see what psychedelic reform could do in DC. I know that DC was on the forefront of cannabis reform, and that was a pretty popular initiative when that passed. It was like 64%. And, we decriminalized before California did. And if California hasn't done it yet, that's pretty progressive. So I figured that psychedelics could potentially have the same impact, but I never thought that I would be the face of any campaign. Like I said, my husband worked in the political world in DC, and I just wanted to help out a campaign that would start in DC. I didn't really want to head it up, but I got connected to Dr. Bronner's. He's got an activism team in DC. They're the ones that ran the cannabis reform here. And Dr. Bronner's was interested. He funds a lot of the campaigns that happen all over the country currently. And he was interested in what, we could do in DC. It just so happens the Dr. Bronner's team in DC knew my husband through his time when he worked at the legislature. So they called my husband up and they said, we want to discuss this campaign with you guys. Why don't we all go to dinner? We all went to dinner. I explained what my experience was with psychedelics. And, they were basically like, you need to be the person that's running this campaign. You need to be the face of this. Your story is so impactful that, so many people can relate to you. And I was like, basically like, hell no. I've got 2 kids in school. I'm not going to put my life out there for people to openly criticize. Like, I want my kids to be normal. Like, we just got through this like massive life-changing thing where their mother, their one support system, and my kids are pretty young. Like right now they're 7 and 4. So they were younger at the time. I wanted them to have the most normal life possible. And I felt like I wanted to make up for time that I lost with them. And they were just like, please consider it. So a couple months went by and, it got to a point where we needed to submit the paperwork to the officials in DC to get onto the general election ballot. So Trump's potential reelection, where we knew voter turnout was going to be high. The night before we were going to submit the paperwork, I completely backed out. I said, I'm not doing this, because I can't control what fallout will happen to my children. And then I went to bed that night after I sent that text message, and I just lost it completely. I was so upset. And my husband and I were just talking to each other, and he was like, you should feel good about this decision. You should feel relieved. And I was like, I don't feel relieved. I feel like I need to do this campaign. I think that people need to hear my story. I feel like people could relate to me. So the next morning, I called everyone up and I said, all right, let's do it. We submitted the paperwork, and then fast track and a campaign during a pandemic. And, we won by 76%. And I really think a lot of that was because we shared my story, of course, with psychedelics and mental health, but, we shared a lot of people's story, and we created a safe space for people to share their stories. I can't tell you how many times people have reached out to me and have said, thank you for sharing. Like, I wish my mother battled postpartum. I wish she had access to something like this, or my wife. Everyone has a story. There's a person that's really near and dear to them that mental health challenges have touched. And I think that this is such an issue that just like permeates through society that no one really ever talks about, because we do live this kind of like, what's on your Instagram feed and what kind of life are you presenting to people? And, and everything needs to be perfect, and you have to be the perfect mother and like the perfect employee that's like really achieving a lot of things in your career. But at the end of the day, we're all real people and we're all human, and it's okay to be vulnerable. And there's a lot of power in that. So I think that that's one really beautiful thing that psychedelic reform will bring out, is kind of like the honesty again in our society and our humanity.
Well, and it's great that you experienced some positive results from those substances, specifically psilocybin first and then ayahuasca. But wouldn't it be great if you could do it in the context of, like you were saying, having a community, having therapists who are trained in using these substances and have dealt with it with a lot of patience, so that they could help guide you through it? Wouldn't it be wonderful if this wasn't pushed underground and still getting such amazing results? Even though there's so little support. And when you look at the ketamine clinics, very often it's done in conjunction with therapy. So they're getting all of that. They're not just getting something to go home with, but they're actually being walked through the process. And it seems like a very healthy, very productive way to go about it. To have it not be available for all these other substances, again, it is very, very frustrating when you see how excited the smartest people are who have devoted their lives to treating these things, how excited they are getting about the potential of psychedelics. The slow movement can be very, very frustrating. And as you brought up, to today's society, our heads are being bombarded with stress in ways that, our brains were not evolved to deal with. And here we have this amazing tool, a tool that seems in some ways to treat the actual problem as opposed to just treating symptoms of the problem. The potential seems limitless. It just seems.
There's amazing potential here. These are the only substances that regenerate brain neurons. And that's, seemingly a challenge for modern healthcare is, how do we repair things that have previously been unrepairable? And psychedelics really pose that a new potential and a real frontier for healthcare, and how we can potentially reform healthcare to support psychedelic therapy. Yeah, it would have been amazing if I could just go to a therapist's office and have like a 4 or 5 hour psilocybin session. I would have loved to have done that at the time, but instead I had to figure it out on my own and figure out, I would be weighing out my microdoses every morning. And like in the beginning, it was kind of touchy. Like sometimes I don't know if I was taking enough. Sometimes I took too much, and, I would go to work, of course, but like, when you're microdosing, a too big of a microdose is, you're a little extra happy and you're maybe seeing sparkles everywhere. Like that was like the risk that I took on, and it shouldn't be that way. We should have proven protocols that work, and people should be supportive, and they should have the access to the therapy as much as they need. I just imagine that this can like really be transformative in somebody's life. I mean, me doing it underground and out of my bedroom closet isn't definitely not ideal, but when you're dealing with a mental health struggle, you're desperate to do anything.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's great to talk to you with boots on the ground. I hope that they do listen to you, and I hope that these studies prove that you get the funding, and the studies continue to show the promise that the previous ones have. But thank you for being the boots on the ground. Thank you for leading the charge. Very much appreciate it, and very much appreciate having you here on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, travelers. And if you want to learn more about the information Jeff and I shared, you can visit the websites Analytical Cannabis and Filter, as described in our description below. I'm also sharing the page here for you to view. And you can also reach out to Melissa. Her contact is also in the description below. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks, everyone. Thanks
Thank
for joining us.
you.